everybody. I'm Denise Marconish. I'm the Senior Curator and Director of Exhibitions here at Mass MoCA, and really happy to have you all here for the recording of this talk with Blane De St and some folks that he's been working with over the years. So this talk will be on the Mass MoCA at Home page, and it will premiere as part of a festival that we've been doing a series of programming called Time of Now, which looks at some of our moments, most pressing issues, from things like monuments to collective history and memory, and here talking about climate change. There'll be on-site and virtual programming that will happen at Mass MoCA on June 26th. And so I encourage everybody to check out our website. Blane De St's exhibition, How to Move a Landscape, opened here at Mass MoCA in July of last year, installed mid-pandemic, which was quite a feat, but we did it, and was really the culmination of many years worth of art making and research, and looks at Blane's collaborations with scientists and science advocates and science writers of how art can really help us better understand and image what's happening to our planet. So I'm going to introduce our panelists today. Blane, who is the artist of How to Move a Landscape, and Blane has worked internationally, nationally. He's had shows at Fredericks and Fraser in New York, Sculpture Center in Long Island, the Contemporary Art Center in New Orleans, the Kathmandu International Triennial, the Nepal Arts Council, the Bass Museum in Miami, and many, many more. He is the recipient of a Paul Kastner grant, the Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, and Joan Mitchell grants, and a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship. Blane's show will be on view here through the summer, so I hope people will be able to come see it. And then joining Blane, and you know, the panelists will get into this a bit more, but Blane, you know, works really collaboratively. I think many artists these days work in a research mode rather than just solitary in their studio. And that involves consulting with different people who are thinking about the field, going out into the landscape and doing research. And so we're looking forward to this sort of lively conversation about that practice. Joining Blane is Julie Brigham-Grette. And Julie is a professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she's worked since 1987. She has also been chair of the National Academy of Sciences Polar Research Board, and has over 40 years of experience working in the Arctic, and was a US chief scientist. Oh, Julie, I'm gonna botch this pronunciation, at the lake. Help me out here. Say it again. Elgigitkin Scientific Drilling Program in Northeast, in Arctic Russia. Right. Also joining us is Tatiana Schlossberg, who's an award-winning journalist and former New York Times science writer. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, Boston Globe, and her book, Inconspicuous Consumption, The Environmental Impact You Didn't Know You Had, looks at the unseen environmental and climate impacts of the internet and technology, food, fashion, and fuel. And it won the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award in 2020. And then moderating our discussion is Jeffrey Kastner, who also contributed to Blane's catalog, which you can get at the Mass MoCA store, hardware online. Jeffrey is a New York-based writer and critic. He's the senior editor of Cabinet magazine, and he has edited volumes including Land and Environmental Art from Phaidon, Nature from the MIT Whitechapel series, and most recently was a co-author with Claire Lehman on Artists Who Make Books. He's a regular contributor to Art Forum and has also appeared in The Economist, Frieze, New Republic, and the New York Times. So I welcome you all. If anybody has any questions, I'm gonna ask you to please put them in the chat and I will be monitoring that. And now I'm gonna turn it over to Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise, and nice to see you all. So my job here is really to facilitate a conversation, which I'm sure will be an interesting one between the three of you. But I thought it might make sense, since you're going to be talking about the environment, climate change from the point of view of a scientist, the point of view of a journalist and writer, and the point of view of an artist. I thought I would talk a little bit about Blane's work from a more art historical perspective. I think of Blane's work as coming out of a trajectory of a kind of work that really began in the 1960s called land art. And land art was part of a sort of movement away from certain kinds of modes of experiencing work in galleries, and was increasingly over the sort of first 3 or 4 years moved from centers like New York out to the desert, primarily out to the West. And this kind of question to the solitary artist versus the collaborative artist is a very interesting one, because the earliest practitioners of land art were very much about a kind of solitary experience of the land. And also the practice at its earliest moments was very kind of extractive, if that makes sense. They basically took very heavy machinery out into the landscape and made work with the land by changing it, by digging it, by building structures in it. And that kind of practice, which typically was a kind of very male practice, and a very American practice. And at the same time as this was going on in the United States, there was an allied group of artists who had a very different attitude about the land. They were working primarily in Europe, and their work was more about observation and about recording their experiences in the landscape. And so from the very beginning of land art, there was this tension between these kinds of two impulses: the impulse of the sort of solitary figure, working in an extractive way, working to dominate the landscape in some sense, and the figure of an artist who had more of an empathetic relationship with the landscape. And sort of driving down the middle of those two things quite quickly became an interest in the landscape as a site of remediation. And even the earliest artists in the land art tradition, most notably Robert Smithson, who was probably the most articulate and well-known theorist of the land artists, started out on the one side of it. He went out, and dug stuff up. And very soon thereafter, he had already started to recognize that there was something about the landscape that wasn't just there for him to take, and that there was a kind of remediative potential in what he was doing, and especially a collaborative potential. And so I see Blane's work as descending from that kind of strand of land art, that more collaborative aspect of making. And it's interesting, I'll read just very briefly, Smithson in '72, after saying things like, the desert is just a concept, it's not really a place, it's a place where artists can go to sort of clear their heads. Just very soon thereafter, he writes, "The artist, ecologist, and industrialist must develop in relation to each other rather than continue to work and produce in isolation. The visual values of the landscape have been traditionally the domain of those concerned with the arts. Yet art, ecology, and industry as they exist today are for the most part abstracted from the physical realities of specific landscapes or sites." And so he was really making an argument for kind of specificity. And I think this is something that's also important in Blane's work. The landscape is not just a conceptual location for Blane. It's a place where real things are happening, where real issues are in play. And I think that's why it's interesting to see the kind of conversation we're having here, where we have a scientist and a journalist who's focused on, and an author who's focused on climate change issues, on scientific issues. And the fact that that's the kind of dialogue we're having here is just emblematic of the kind of dialogue that is baked into the way Blane makes his work. And so that's just a very brief précis in a sort of art historical sense. So I actually think I might start with you, Blane, and ask you a bit, for the audience who may not really know about how the show was built, what your sort of goals were with it. I know it's a project that in some sense is a summation of a long period of your practice. And I wondered if you could just sort of talk us through what led up to this kind of, summary moment in your work at Mass MoCA.
I've been dealing with humankind's intervention with land and landscape since the early 80s, a long time. And touched upon, including in the late 80s and 90s, endangered species and what was going on. And this whole climate change and land keeps cycling back and through the moments for this. And I hope this moment that's coming now is stronger to make a bigger impact. Having said that, I used to have a conversation with the public. I use the landscape. It's loaded with information. It has an inherent embedded connection to humankind. And I really use it to have the narrative of the conversation with the public, and it's important. It's about environmental issues and what is happening, what is relationship with that land. And I want to thank you for that brief historical connection point too, because I just want to emphasize too, I've discovered as an artist, the isolated studio days are gone. Just internet mining doesn't do it, especially when you try to take on subjects that are very complex, dealing with peoples and scientists and industry and governments. You try to understand it to try to re-render it in a respectful way. I also think that from my perspective, I think artists, especially now, have a huge responsibility to take on these narratives, in my case, climate change or the environment, that are here now, and they're responsible for this time frame and culturally what's going on. So I think it went all over the place, Jeff, a bit like you, but I hope I touched upon it.
Right. Right. And I'm curious, from the perspective of both Julie and Tatiana, what it is about an artistic practice that you think, what this kind of contributes to the discourse around these issues that you are dealing with as a scientist and as a journalist. I mean, traditionally, artists have sought out scientists to work with them. I wonder if, Julie, and I'll go to you first, I wonder if there's a role for the artist somehow from the perspective of the scientist in doing what you're doing, or is your work and the artist's work too different? Where are the meeting points between what a scientist might do relative to these kinds of issues and what an artist like Blane might do?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have in doing science, and particularly myself as a geologist, I work on long time scales. So I'm thinking, I work on the last 3 million years of Earth history and what is happening today compares to what naturally happened in the past. And one of my challenges has always been, how do I communicate the urgency of now to what I know as a geologist, because the timescales are so difficult for people to understand. So for many people, the concept that we could be altering the planet so rapidly is just really difficult to explain. And I think that through the arts, there is a better way of explaining what's happening for people to understand it, because they can relate better to an artistic work. Just like, for example, a large mural on the side of a building that expresses something about climate change will get people to think about it better than if they read my journal article, right? So I'm one of my efforts here recently is really just try to, how do I bring my science knowledge into, to make it policy relevant, but also communicate that to the public, who then vote on those policies, you know, when they go to the voting box. I mean, we need to make that connection between that urgency. So to me, this is a absolutely wonderful challenge to work together with someone like Blane to try to help communicate that better. That's really where I'm coming from.
Right, and I know, Tatiana, part of the argument of your book, which as I understand it, is that the scale of some of these questions is such that they're very difficult to grasp. And so part of the project of your writing has been to particularize and make more granular and more specific and closer to day-to-day life the kinds of questions that actually have the impact on these issues, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the book that I wrote is, you know, it's about our stuff, as was mentioned, you know, the internet, food, fashion, and fuel. But it's, you know, it's about how we are, you know, through the impacts associated with producing, consuming, and throwing away those things, you know, we connect to people in other parts of the world through their impacts and also through the impact that they have on climate change. And so really, it's not about individual behavior. You know, it's more about these systemic challenges. But, you know, I think following on what Julie said, I think there has been, you know, this overwhelming focus on the need for scientists to communicate. And I think actually it's for the rest of us to translate their work, for writers like me and artists like Blane to make that work accessible to people, to help them understand it on this human scale, whether that's, you know, I mean, of course, they're the experts on their work, but they do that work. And the rest of us, you know, have to interpret that work. And as she said, apply it to our political system and to, you know, the way our civic life. So I think, you know, hopefully journalism can do that. But I think also art is, I mean, I think in terms of my work, stories are really what I think make people learn and remember. And art, I think, tells us what it means to be human and helps us make sense of the times that we're living in. And, you know, climate change is, of course, a huge part of the time that we're living in and the times to come. So I think, you know, the work that Blane is doing to translate the work of scientists like Julie and others, you know, to that realm is so essential.
I'm curious about this concept of the work as being a kind of act of translation. What do you make of that, Blane? Does that ring true to you?
I like it a lot. I mean,
yeah.
I think visual artists are storytellers. I think we have a responsibility to get those clips in time and share, especially someone like me that has an opportunity through great people like Julie to travel to places that other people aren't going to go and witness things that are no longer going to be around. You know, I have a big responsibility to deliver that narrative. And that's the way that the viewer or the public can really, you know, enter into the conversation. So I love what you said, Tatiana.
Right. I mean, talk a little bit about that act of translation and the kind of way that your working process takes on board what are quite large scale questions, quite complicated science. Is the goal to boil it down, as it were, or is it to make some kind of companion expression that is not really just a kind of distillation of the data, but actually produces some kind of different effect in the viewer than just like a new way to understand sort of specific pieces of information?
That's a great question. I suppose like an author, you get into writing something, or even sometimes a scientist, you have 1,000 words and it has to be brought down to 500. It's editing. My big focus is not to lecture to the audience, to the public, because they don't like that. They want to investigate, they want to enter into the conversation. So I just try to visually open the door. I do it through visually tactile, experiences for them on a 3-dimensional, so they feel they can enter into this world, this kind of landscape. And once they do, there are heavy subjects that I'm dealing with, dissolving landscapes, altering landscapes, crushing, tumbling down. And but they come through the conversation and they want to start investigating. And then it's not really my responsibility to dictate that it's a test that they're supposed to know all this information. I think once you get that connection point, once you get that visitation, then they start coming in the door in the conversation and participating. And that's the way I see it.
Right. And so, Julie, when you are doing your field work and doing your research, are you always thinking about ways that this information can be disseminated and sort of instrumentalized in a kind of policy way? Or is that very much a second moment in the way that you think about the kind of work you do? I know you're going on a research trip here. You're going to be gone. You're going to be doing a lot of work. Are those quite separate kinds of operations for you in your practice as a scientist?
Well, I think it depends on the project. In this coming July, I'm going to be on Svalbard with funding from the National Geographic. And a lot of this work is really about telling the story, about looking at the retreat of the glaciers as the scientific questions of how the warming ocean is impacting the front of these glaciers. And we're going to be able to create measurements about that, but it's also about telling the story. So we've, in this particular project, deliberately thought about how to start to frame the story, how to not only just show a changing landscape, but also the human element of it, what it means as a humans, and try, one of the concepts that I've been trying to develop is the idea that we need people to see themselves as part of the ecosystem, part of the environment that we're in, that we're like the animals and we need to think about how we get a better sense of balance in that ecosystem. We're out of balance with it right now. So to me, telling the story is not just about the adventure, but it's also about why what I'm observing, why is it happening? How is it connected back to the consumer consumption and other issues with fossil fuels, for example, and just to make that connection back. So communicating that story is important, and in trying to get the people to understand the connection between, what's happening in the Arctic isn't just happening up there, it's happening globally. And the fact that what's happening globally is really important. So. And
as you think about that, what are the kinds of avenues that strike you as the best for getting this information out to people? Is it by working with journalists like Tatiana? Is it, this presumably is a relatively new thing in the scientific community, this sense, at least relative to climate change of, and maybe I'm wrong and you'll correct me, but I would have assumed that hasn't long been part of the practice of scientists, this kind of notion of how do we frame our story for the public? Is that a relatively new thing in your discipline?
To some extent, I think there are some people that have been doing that for a long time, because we know, whether it's through NOVA or National Geographic or any kind of visual representation, that's long been the case. But I can tell you, quite honestly, the science community is more engaged than ever with trying to step out of our comfort zone and try to communicate it in a different way. And for example, I recently wrote an article for a academic website called The Conversation. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. They produce articles from professors like me from all kinds of disciplines. And one, I tried to characterize what the world will be like with a world with CO2 at 420 parts per mil. That article, I was just blown away. It got 250,000 reads, there's no way any paper I would write in Science or Nature would ever get read by that many people. And so it really, I think that this way of communicating, turning what we do into a journal story that someone might put in a newspaper is really important for getting the word out.
Right, and that might arguably reach an audience of a different kind of audience than your piece for Nature would, an audience of policymakers and of people who...
Yeah, for example, I had tens of thousands of reads from people who were connected with the stock market. That just totally surprised me. But that means they're thinking about
waking up. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They're waking up, and so that experiment for me led me to think, yeah, this is really important to do. We're reaching very different audiences.
And Tatiana, have you found as a journalist that your interactions with scientists have changed as this kind of desire to get information? I mean, are people more forthcoming? Are they trying to, do you get a sense that they're trying to figure out how best to tell a kind of story to somebody like you who's has the ability to, share this kind of story with a large audience?
Well, scientists and climate scientists in particular have always been so generous with their time and expertise to me. And I assume that's across the board, but also, I didn't have a science background before I started writing about climate change. So really taking a lot of time to explain difficult concepts. And I think that the point of doing research is for people to use it and to understand it and to, change the world may be a lofty goal, but that's actually what is going on in this particular case. And so I think it's incredibly important to them. And, everyone, again, has always been so generous and, with their knowledge and expertise, but also really excited to talk to a reporter, which sometimes people aren't. So that always feels very nice. But yeah, and I think anyone taking an interest in what you do always feels good. But of course, what they're doing is so important for the rest of us. So I think it's, it works both ways, that everyone feels pretty grateful for everyone else's work, which is very nice.
Right. Have you found that your exchanges with scientists over the years, Blane, have evolved too? Has there been a kind of greater openness? Has been a change in any way with your kind of, I know you've been collaborating with scientists on various projects for many, many years.
From my perspective, I think it changed for the better, over the years. The door is wider open and in a very positive way. And I think, like Julie was saying, they're truly looking for a bigger audience, a bigger connection point to get the word out. They truly believe now it's a moral imperative. And if myself, I suppose like a journalist, I'm presenting a bigger audience to them, a connection point, and try to, like a better word, re-render what they're talking about to try to reach that bigger audience. And as long as it's done in a respectful, thoughtful, research somewhat manner, that they seem to be very much so connected to it, which is exciting for me. I mean, when I first started doing that, I thought, honestly, I'm not a journalist, so which opens a different kind of door. So I would reach out to the deputy director of the Environmental Research Center, and I would expect them to hang up the phone.
Right.
And surprisingly, they didn't. They wanted to have the conversation, and they wanted to know where I was coming from and why and what the outcome was, just like a scientific research. And so that was exciting. And I also share that over my years, the connection with the scientists, it has changed me the way I look at the landscape, look at the research, and look at where it's coming from. So I like Tatiana, would like to thank them quite seriously for opening that door so wide.
How has it changed?
Well, first of all, I could not have access a reporter would be different. You know, like when it was New Orleans, they would make phone calls and I would go and talk to the scientists, the U.S. Geological Survey about what's happening in New Orleans and the wetlands. Doors in the Arctic would be open, introductions to communities I could not reach. And most importantly, you know, I'm not so fact-based when I create something or realistically, but it's still important to me to understand what is happening from a scientific standpoint with the landscape and time, as Julie refers to it. So those inputs to me artistically are everything, you know. Again, I said earlier, I really meant it. You can't sit at a computer and do internet mining on these subjects. It doesn't work.
Right, right. And I haven't had a chance to see the show yet at Mass MoCA. I'll be seeing it later this summer, but I know that the show includes both works that are evocative in a sort of more art kind of object sense, but I know you've also included a kind of data room where you have a different kind of angle on this. And I'm curious about the relationship of those two things. Some of the work itself, it doesn't have to be data rich. It's meant to be evocative or symbolic or to make and have an impact on the viewer in a different way. But it's backed up by this kind of, like, the presence of this kind of data is always available for the viewer as well. Are those things at odds with each other as an artist?
Well, that's a good question, because in early days when I was doing heavy documentation and field research, that I call it, going out there in the landscape and shooting and interviewing scientists, I would not show it, but working with Denise, who's an amazing curator, we came to the decision it's nice to take the public through this walk of those kinds of connection points and the background of where it all comes from. And it strengthens the conversation and connection point with them. So Julie, an amazing group of, I think, 13 other scientists from Russia, all over the United States and internationally, were kind enough to let me interview them too, and allow them philosophically, science-wise, to give some insight for a few minutes of their perspective on climate change and what's going on. So, yeah, and also I see scientists differently now. I mean, I had all these preconceived notions of what a scientist was, but they see land respectfully and environment very respectfully, and they're kind of collectors and creative the way they think. And so I find the conversations, the way they break down things in their mind process, to me visually, very, very, very strengthening my artistic approach to things.
Right, and presumably visualization is not an alien concept for a scientist. You have to figure out how to visualize your information as well, presumably, not necessarily in an artistic way, but I mean, all of that is part of clarification and making your information clear and expressive of what the data tells, right?
Yeah, for example, Julie is truly an expert in Glacier.
Right.
Glacier. And I was, a number of years ago, taken back that they looked at a glacier as a living thing, scientists. I mean, that was amazing to me. And that when it sheds on the side, this dead ice is no longer part of the living thing, so it's dead. And it's this whole kind of metaphor and symbol, the way they break it down, and again, look at it scientifically.
Right, and I should have been more clear. I was actually directing that toward Julie. I mean, what role does visualization play in the kind of research you do and the way you present your information? Is it, if I read one of your papers, would I be reading just text? Would I be reading mathematics and geological information? Is there any, like, I understand the way that you have, the kind of work that you do can be expressed in the kind of work that Blane does, but I'm curious the degree to which that mode of expression has any kind of traction in the scientific world specifically of its own.
Oh, absolutely. The effort that I put into a graph, the colors, being mindful of color blindness, which lines, color lines I use, but also keeping the figure or the diagram that's telling what's happening in a way that communicates very easily. That's really important. So I just recently gave a series of 10 lectures over the last year about some work I did in Russia. And I must explain that every single frame in that talk, I thought about the colors and, not too much text, and really thinking about how to get that message across, to keep it simple. At the same time, while you're telling a story that's somehow difficult and it's urgent, we also have to be hopeful. So there has to be a way for people to say, okay, this is a challenge. The challenge is opportunity. We need to, because particularly when I talk to young people, you're talking, let's say talking at a 6th grade level, what you're showing them has to be in a very simple way, but it's also got to be hopeful. And I think the same is true in communicating with adults at a 6th grade level. It kind of tells the same story. Keep it simple and make it interesting, and almost try to think of it artistically, how you present it.
I mean, I think that question of hopefulness is really interesting. I mean, Tatiana, I know from what I know of your writing too, that you're interested in not just like, making a litany of all the things that are falling apart, but also to talk about potential ways to address some of those questions. And that is part of your practice as a journalist, right?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, people are incredibly interested and hungry for solutions, to feel like there is a possibility for hope and, to do things differently. And, I think it also would be I think it's a disservice to the work of scientists, as well as everybody else, to only focus on how terrible things are. Because I think, we know what happens if we do nothing, which is that things get worse and the predictions come true. And, the only, the biggest variable in all of this is human behavior. And so, I think it's important to emphasize that, and to emphasize that things can be different, and it really depends on what we do. But also I think, these kind of very doom and gloom and sort of fear-based conversations so far haven't gotten us anywhere. So, I think it's important to try different things, because we really need everybody. And I think if people feel like there's room for them, or that, they're not condemned because they forgot to bring a bag to the grocery store, or whatever it is, they're not going to want to help. So, I think it is, of course you have to be realistic about what the science says, and, but also that, there is opportunity to do things differently.
Blaine, would you say your work is hopeful?
My opinion in this case might not matter, but
I mean, do you?
It's a serious subject, and so I have to be serious about it. And they are on the heavy side, but they're visually beautiful and spectacular, like nature. So, in the environment. So, yeah, there's a balance that I have to do there. I mean, people want to walk into something that has mystery, beauty, and enlightenment to bring them into the conversation. So it has to be a combination. Don't know if I'm a happy guy, Jeff, sorry.
Well, I didn't say happy, I said hopeful. Maybe they're the same thing in some ways. I mean, because it does seem dire, and I think that's the challenge. I'm a lay reader of this material, is to try and balance a sense of having gone over the edge, over the cliff in some sense, as opposed to paddling toward the cliff and still having time to turn it around. And so I think that's, just as a person in the world, I think that's a real challenge. And I think, you're dealing, Julie, with data. You're going to go up and take a look at these glaciers, and you're going to find what you find. And I assume it's not going to be good news, because there doesn't seem to be much good news about ocean warming and glacier destruction. But you do still, hope is not just a kind of way to keep people interested. It's still there still is something to be hopeful about, right? Is that what you think?
Yeah. I was taken by an article I read recently about, it talked about the S curve of adaptation. And this S curve went from, think of it as nobody has one of these to everyone wants one, and then everyone has one, okay? And one of the examples was used was a picture of a parade in New York City in 1905. There was, the parade was all horses and one car. And then they showed the same parade in New York City in, I think it was 1915 or 1920, and it was all cars and one horse. And so this idea that there's this rapid change that can happen, whether it's how many people have a color TV, how many people have a cell phone. Think of all the different things that we've gone through that S curve. We're in the S curve for wind power, for solar, for electric cars. We're going through this new S curve. And so I think if everyone kind of thinks about, oh yeah, we went from horse and buggy to cars in 15, 20 years, we're now going to try to make that transition to off fossil fuels onto other things. And then you suddenly realize, oh yeah, maybe we can do this. And that to me is this time perspective that people think about the adaptation to new ways of doing things, like Tatiana's writing about. We can do this. We can, it doesn't always have to be done the same way. So that's where we can be hopeful.
Right. I guess the one thing that always occurs to me is things that have already been done that can't be undone, even if we adapt and adopt.
Oh yeah.
And the things that are beyond repair, I think, are the things that trouble a lot of people when they think about the environment. The things that all the sort of behavior modification in the world is not going to fix, which is not an argument to not modify your behavior, obviously. But I think that's what troubles a lot of lay people's ideas about what's going on with the environment. But I was fascinated to hear that you had so many readers in the financial community,
Right.
Which, I mean, I know there's a great deal of interest in, certainly in the financial community and the insurance community, sort of, catastrophe insurance, disaster, climate insurance. And maybe that is the class of people that have to have their minds changed in order for it to filter down into real sort of policy changes. Whether it can fix stuff that's already gone around the bend, I don't know, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
I think,
Yeah, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Tatiana.
no, I just, we often talk about climate change as if the only cost is adaptation, right? Like there's a huge cost to the status quo. And in so many ways, of course, financially, but also in terms of health and lives and biodiversity and, everything else. So I think people who are studying risk and how much things cost, can't help but be aware of that. But I do think that's been an element missing from the conversation, is how expensive it will be to do nothing.
Right, exactly. And the
I was just going to intersect that one of the things that is not reversible is sea level rise. We can drop CO2 and change the temperature of the planet, but you're not going to change the sea level rise in human times.
Right. There's no place to put it back, right? Exactly.
Right. You can't make ice sheets that fast.
Right. I'm curious, Blaine, what you have been hearing from people who have come through the show. I know you said you've had a lot of excellent attendance numbers despite all of the challenges of the last long year plus. What do you get? What sense do you get of the audience and the way they respond to the work, and what do you think they're taking away from it?
Well, it's hard me, the artist, to interpret that, but I always talk to the security guards at Mass MoCA who tell me that it opens doors for the public. They like it. And, some artists are offended by this, but I think it's also an Instagrammable show, and it's kind of barrage on social media. And I think that's great. Just gets more of the word out there, more than the audience that would actually arrive at the museum and those kinds of connection points. And, I even managed to, I apologize, I don't know which one was the National or something, a conservative online magazine, took on the exhibition from a critical analysis standpoint and started talking about the art and kind of refused to accept the content that drove it about climate change. But in my mindset, I thought it was great because they already came through the door and started that conversation with themselves, having to defend it or bend the conversation in a certain way. So, yeah.
It's good. It was good art, but shame about the content. Is that the idea, basically?
Yeah, they didn't. They had to keep on interjecting. Well, I don't really believe this fact about climate change, and I really don't believe this. And after a while, when you're reading this, it kind of weaves the story the other way, as from my perspective. So, I think it's important that we open the door for everybody. I want to add too, that comes in. And I mean, I get the strangest connections, emails through Facebook or otherwise. I just changed my furnace because I saw your show, which I never expected from visual arts. But it's all good as far as I'm concerned. You know, I don't have this lofty thing about the process of making art. I'm just looking at a relationship with the viewer and a conversation. And back to what I think Tatiana said, that we are the narrators of what's going on in our time and storytellers. And I think that's important. So.
I'm getting a note here that it's getting to be time for us to move on to the Q&A. Just bear with me. Yeah. Okay. So the show is up until the end of the summer.
Please see it, everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just curious now that it's been up. How does a show like this, such a major show, like affect what you're on to next? Is this something that, I mean, have you reached the end of this particular kind of part of your practice, part of your interest, or is this a prelude to something? Where does this go going forward?
There was a time of exhaustion, but no, you know, I'm looking for the next connection point. And actually, Julie here was very, very kind to collaborate with me. And we put forward, we don't know what's going to happen, with an NSF grant to bring me and some people and her and her science team back up to the high Arctic and the Alaskan territory on the Bering Sea side. So these connection points keep growing and changing. And again, that was very kind to her, because I couldn't do that kind of lifting without such a professional and knowledge-based person as her.
Do NSF grants typically involve artistic collaborators on the team, or is that an unusual thing to apply for a grant with an artist, Julie?
Yeah. That's pretty different.
It is pretty different.
But I'm also involved in another related project with Indigenous people and people who work within the Alaskan tribal communities who are artists also. And so we hope we funded, because it'll just be it'll be a lot of fun. And I think, you know, there'll be wonderful products that come out of it. But yeah, it's very different. But I think we went through a program about alternate education of STEM, of how science communities. So it's targeted particularly to alternate ways, informal ways to express science. And so I'm very, very hopeful.
Right. Interesting. All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time. And I see that Denise has popped back on here.
Hi, everybody. That was so fantastic. And Julie, actually, one of the questions I wanted to pose to Blaine sort of comes off of what you were just talking about a little bit, which is, Blaine, can you talk a little bit more about your process? So you have an idea of what kind of landscape you're interested in. You seek out people who might be specialists in this. And how do you then make those connections? How do you take that information from the field to the studio? So Jeffrey, I was thinking a lot about how you sort of opened the conversation talking about those dualities between observation and doing, and the solitary and the collaborative. And I think in many ways, Blane, you kind of do all of those things. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you process this information then when you're back in your studio, or here at Mass MoCA, which we turned into a giant studio for you, how you sort of think through all of that.
Yeah. I'm well, early discovery was my comment, I think twice in this discussion, was internet mining just doesn't do it. So I have these preconceived notions, and then I take a look at what I think I want to research and where I want to go in the conversation and the connection points. And then I try to focus on the economics, the money, how to get there, the people that you need to reach out to. And I kind of like a journalist, and I don't want to cross that line, but I start making cold calls, and I expect people to hang up, yell at me, all kinds of things, and try to open up the door to try to understand. And that conversation over the phone starts feeding what's going on. And I also have to have those invitations to go to those places. They're far-reaching, they're difficult, and they really require those connection points. And then I also discovered that whatever I come up with before doesn't happen, because when I get to that place, that site, that landscape, and do the research, the conversation visually, aesthetically, as an artist, flips around in my brain and becomes something else, and something I think visually stronger. So I just know to myself, I have to do this and I have to be there. I'm not an adventurous person. I just need to strengthen the visual conversation I want to have through the landscape of the public. That's what I do. And then I come back, and then I'm usually terrified in the studio for a while, trying to figure out what I want to do with a giant glacier or a melting permafrost to have the conversation. I will say Mass MoCA was transformative for me, because there's no other museum that allows you to engineer and build on the scale 3 stories high. And I like that, not to build big art, but to build art that people can visually enter into and become part of the landscape and walk around it, was everything for me. So that was transformational. It's hard to talk about the studio. They go through sketches, documentation back and forth, a lot of failures, and failures are great, to try to figure out how to become. And then there's, on the scale I work, there's economics, there's my ability to actually build what I want to build. Sometimes my ideas get a little far-fetching and they're not really feasible, as Denise is smiling there. And so I had to be reeled in as an artist, which is pretty typical. But I really want a visual impact on the viewer. It's my relationship in the viewer that also drives me, besides the subject and the research. I need to have that conversation with them, and especially the importance of what I'm trying to take on, which is all of us, climate change and the environment. So I think I didn't answer that, Denise, but I tried.
You answered it. The other 2 sort of concepts that kept coming to my mind as you guys were all talking, one was of Timothy Morton's notion of the hyperobject, of this thing that is so big and so ungraspable. And of course, climate change is one of those that we feel almost defeated in the face of it. And then I think about that in relationship to a conversation I once had with a scientist who's at the SETI Institute, where I had helped start a artist in residence program. And when he saw what one of the artists had produced, he said, I understand what art can do. It is spontaneous comprehension. And I thought that was really interesting, that art can almost create inroads to the hyperobject. And I wonder, from Julie and Tatiana's point of view, of like, how do you see art further supporting what you do? And what is your reaction when somebody like Blane calls you up and says, hey, I've got this idea? How do you then navigate that kind of process?
I'll let Tatiana go first.
Oh, you're on mute, Tatiana.
Sorry. I was just trying to avoid the, echo. My dad is a visual artist, and also has a degree in physics. And so he's always used science in his art. And a couple of years ago, he did a show actually where he made drawings of neuronal image patterns. And so, which were really beautiful, which you can get from seeing, photos of them, but kind of having that transposed into art was, I think, just a really cool representation of how these things are not as far apart as we sometimes think. I think like humanity or art and science can, I think the way that we often learn about them in school is like, it's two different parts of the brain and two different parts of, people who do those things are different people. But actually there is so much overlap. And I think, part of that is of course the aesthetic beauty, but also, and just, the visual language. But I think it is all part of the same project, which is trying to understand and explain the world that we live in. And so, I don't feel qualified to be a part of this conversation at all, not being an artist or a scientist, but it's been very nice to be consulted and, for Blane to want to include me. So I'm thrilled to get a chance to, of course, meet and talk with these amazing people, but also to think more about these intersections.
I'm trying to remember the first email I got from Blane. I didn't put it in the junk or the trash because I am interested. I have had a mind shift in the last 5-6 years about how the need to communicate. And I get it, how art and science have to come together. And so, of course, I got back to him, I hope right away, as far as I can remember. So, because there is this really deep connection. And so to me, as I said before, challenge is opportunity. And I think this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to have such a collaboration. And I'm learning so much about how to communicate out better just by, even talking and being involved with people like Blane. So.
Yeah, I think it's really nice that the notion came up of telling stories. And that really is like the most powerful form of communication. And I think what's really remarkable here in sitting through this conversation is that's what art does, that's what science does, that's what journalism does. And that is what leads to people coming in and having these entry points. So I think, ultimately, you are all storytellers. And I think that's a wonderful thing for our patrons to come into, for the readers of our book to come into, and for people to gain access into all of the important work that you're all doing. So I thank you all for being storytellers. Okay, well, I think that wraps things up unless anybody on the panel has a question for anyone else. Well, thank you all for being part of this. And again, if you go to either our Mass MoCA at home or our Time of Now website, you will find the link. It's also on our Mass MoCA YouTube page. Everybody come see Blane's exhibition before Labor Day.